So welcome. The Rappaport Center is really excited to have three legal luminaries with us today. And they're luminaries in their respective public interest fields, but what they all have in common is that they are each recipients of the MacArthur Fellowship. And for those of you who don't know, the MacArthur Fellowship, commonly known across the United States as the Genius Grant, is an award, unrestricted $625,000 award designed to give thought leaders the freedom and the creativity to pursue their passions and their dreams in their respective fields. And we normally think of, when we think of the MacArthur grants, we normally think of scientists and economists and artists. But in fact, since the MacArthur Awards were started in 1981, several lawyers have been granted MacArthur Foundation Awards, and we have three of them here with us today. To my left, John Rapping, Margaret Stock, and Marie-Therese Connolly. And I'm very, very happy that they could take time out of their incredibly busy schedules to be with us and to share their journeys. Very different careers in public interest law. John Rapping is a criminal lawyer. Margaret Stock is an immigration lawyer, and Marie-Therese Connolly focuses on elder protection and elder abuse. But I think that you'll find their stories compelling and their journeys compelling in terms of how they got to where they were, that they were deemed worthy of a MacArthur Award. The MacArthur Foundation describes the qualifications for the awards in terms that I don't think any of us would think that we ourselves could live up to if we thought of ourselves as applying for it, and it's not something you apply for. They talk about the key traits of tenacity, imagination, risk-taking. And the qualifications for the awards are that you are somebody who's pushing the boundaries in your respective fields. You're pushing the boundaries in your respective fields to try to make the world a better place. And I think that describes all of our three speakers today. We invited them here to share their stories with the students for two reasons. One, they are thought leaders in their fields, and these are three very important fields for all of us to be thinking about. Criminal justice system we all know is broken. The intersection between immigration and national security and protection is on the cover of the newspaper every day. And the baby booming is aging. Baby boomers are aging, and the number of elders in our society in the next 20 years will be growing and growing, and we have to take steps to think about elder protection. So we invited these three people here to talk about their fields, but also, and perhaps most importantly, to talk about their journeys, because from all of your perspective as kind of mid-20-year-olds, 30-year-olds who are thinking about a potential life in public interest, it's hard for you sometimes to imagine what a life in public interest might look like. And a successful career in the public interest space really can't be planned. That's, I think, one of the probably themes that you'll hear throughout these stories. They're incredibly varied and diverse stories, but yet compelling stories. So we just want you to hear about the possibilities in public service law. In the inimitable words of Dr. Seuss, one of my idols, things may happen, and often they do, to people as brainy and footsie as you. So these three people are incredibly brainy. And we won't spend lots of time talking about all of their accolades and their brains. But what I would like to focus on is how they've been footsie throughout their careers, how they've placed themselves in a position that they've been able to do what they've done and what they hope to do in the future with their MacArthur grant. So what I think we'll do is I will introduce each of our speakers. Rather than do the ups and downs, I will introduce all three of them. And then I'll ask them to talk, perhaps in order that they received the MacArthur Award. If you don't mind, Marie-Therese, you can start. Then who was a 2011 awardee. Margaret Stock was a 2013 awardee, and John Rapping was a 2014 awardee. They'll each talk a little bit, maybe 10 minutes or so, about their work, their passions, what they're doing with the MacArthur grant. And then we'll have a question and answer session after that. I know I have questions for them, but I suspect all of you will have lots of questions for them too. So let me introduce our speakers, starting with Marie-Therese Connolly on our far left. As I said, she won the MacArthur Award in 2011. She's received her undergraduate training at Stanford University and her law degree from Northeastern here in Boston. And after law school, she clerked for the 11th Circuit, for a judge on the 11th Circuit Court, United States Circuit Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. After that, she entered the Justice Department Honors Program, which I know is a career path that many of you might be interested in. And in the Justice Department, she specialized in civil fraud cases. And in the civil fraud arena, she developed a specialty and an interest in protecting elders from economic abuse. And as a result of that interest, she was given a special assignment to the Senate to serve as counsel to the Senate Special Committee on Aging. And it was really Marie-Therese's work, her vision, her architectural spirit in designing a law and getting it passed that led to passage of the Elder Justice Act of 2010. From 1999 to 2007, she served as the founding coordinator of the Elder Justice and Nursing Home Initiative at the Department of Justice. And since 2007, she has been a scholar, a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Institute in Washington, D.C. Her current work in elder protection affiliates her with the Appleseed Project, where she's developing a project on protecting the aged for Appleseed, which is a consortium of public interest law firms. Margaret Stock, to Marie-Therese's right, is a 2013 awardee of the MacArthur Grant. She's an immigration, national security, and military law expert. She lives in Alaska. She was raised actually close to here in Wellesley. She received 3 Harvard degrees. She got her joint degree after getting an undergraduate degree at Harvard. She did a joint degree at the Kennedy School of Public Affairs and the law school. And after law school, she went and taught at West Point, where she taught for almost 10 years. She's a lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserves. She was an Army officer before going to law school, went back to the Army Reserves while she was at West Point, and retired after 29 years of service to the Army Reserve at the rank of a lieutenant colonel. She's the author of a book on immigration law and military, and she's a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, other publications on the intersection between immigration law and national security. And Margaret's work views national security as more than just military security. It views it as security in terms of political security, economic security, climate security. And one of the things that's refreshing about her work and innovative is she sees immigration law as something that can contribute to national security rather than undercut national security. And she's been working a lot in that space. You might have read some of her recent comments on birthright citizenship, which has been in the news recently. And then to Margaret's right is John Rapping. John Rapping is a criminal lawyer and a criminal law professor at John Marshall Law School in Atlanta. John works and plows a very similar field to me. He's very concerned about the criminal justice space. He looks at it from the defense perspective. He was a public defender in 3 different offices before moving into academia. He was a public defender at the Public Defense Services in Washington, D.C., which many of you know is one of the most renowned public defense services in the country. He then was a public defender in New Orleans. From there, he went to be a public defender in Georgia. While a public defender, he saw lots of inadequacies in indigent public defense, and while at John Marshall Law School, he founded a project known as Gideon's Promise, which is aimed at improving indigent public defense and training public defenders to do the best job that they can and should do under the Sixth Amendment. So he writes and talks nationally on the subject of what's spoken about our criminal justice system and how we can fix it. John received his undergraduate degree from the University of Chicago and his law degree from George Washington University. So I'm really happy that all 3 of these can be here. People can be here today to share their talents in very diverse areas. And what I asked them to talk about is really how their passions led them to where they are and what their current projects are. The theologian Frederick Beaker once described vocation as the place where your greatest passions meet the world's greatest needs. And so what I'd like to know is how their passions led them to be working on the current needs that they see that the world's facing, and how they got them to where they are. So thank you very much for being here with us. Let's start with Marie-Therese.
Well, thanks so much for, can you guys hear me? Yeah. Thanks so much for having us for that excessive introduction, and to my old friend Lissy Medvedow for helping to engineer this session. You don't usually associate law with MacArthur's, and as I've found, it doesn't really immunize you from being stupid either. So, don't be fooled. My work has involved sort of a combination of intentionality and stumbling into stuff, and I think that's a good thing mostly. Why does age matter? I think I'll start there. As Mike said, the baby boomers are aging, and we kind of hear that and we're kind of numb to it. What it means is that people 85 and older are the fastest growing part of the demographic. That today, or in 2010, according to the census data, we had about 4 million people 85 and older, and by 2050 we're going to have 18 million people. People 85 and older have much higher rates of disabilities, both cognitive disabilities and physical disabilities, and it means that people between ages 18 and 65 have a lot more people who are dependent on them. It's not just kids, but it's a more than doubling of older people who are going to be dependent on both a lot of us and also on the social programs that we know and love. It also means that they're a lot more vulnerable to abuse, neglect, and exploitation in ways that are really complicated, because when it comes to kids are presumptively innocent and lack capacity. And so, as a society, we think, okay, we can intervene. Victims of domestic violence presumptively have capacity and can make decisions about what they want the role of the law to be, notwithstanding the fact that we have mandatory and arrest and prosecution laws in many places. But in any event, we have sort of this idea that people in middle age can be the authors of their own fates. With older people, it's a much more mixed bag. Some people are fully cognitively intact. Some people lack cognitive capacity. And so the role of both family and society is a much more complicated one, including when we intervene in abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And it includes, physical abuse, verbal abuse, neglect, which often happens not only in the family setting, but also in institutional settings. And then exploitation, money comes into it in all kinds of complicated ways. So that's just sort of setting the stage. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but what I thought I would do is explain sort of how I worked my way out of a law job, which involved working my way through a lot of different ways of either practicing law or being involved with the law, and why I think all of that has been really valuable in what I'm doing now. So as Mike said, I started off in the honors program at the Department of Justice, really because I wanted to learn how to be a good lawyer and then go to the Mental Health Law Project, which is now the Bazelon Center, and do that. And then, fate intervened in a number of different ways, including a sick kid. And so I ended up not doing that, but the fraud cases were actually really interesting, and I'll just give you one example. One of the kinds of cases I had was to sue proprietary schools. They would drive around poor neighborhoods and pick up people and get them to sign up for guaranteed student loans. People would be saddled with a lot of debt and wouldn't get a good education out of it. Then I became involved in what we called the Nursing Home Initiative. And that happened because an advocate in California started collecting death certificates and going to the Senate and saying, hey, a lot of people are dying in nursing homes for unexplained reasons. What's going on here? Senator Grassley held a series of hearings and started to hold HHS's feet to the fire and say, what are you guys doing to implement the regs that you were supposed to promulgate as part of the nursing home reform law of 1987? So that taught me a lot about sort of the role of legislation and regulation, and it's a complicated interplay, and it's easy to dismiss. But Lynn Rosenthal, who was the White House guru on domestic violence until recently, told me that she thought that one of her most important roles was to make sure that domestic violence prevention and awareness was written into sort of the interstitial tissue of all the agencies, because a lot of stuff happens at that level. So then there were also cases. There are a lot of, an example of the cases were nursing home chains that were huge behemoths. They had, hundreds and hundreds of facilities, between 200 and some even had 500 and 600 facilities. And the nursing home industry gets $80 billion in public monies every year. And sometimes they don't provide the care that they're supposed to. So we sued them under the False Claims Act, under civil rights laws, and under criminal laws. And they're complicated cases because there was not actually any abuse or neglect law. So it was sort of, around the corner and down the street, often through financial fraud kinds of cases, except under the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act. So I got to see how, federal law, the role of federal laws played in trying to bring essentially an industry into compliance with what the law had intended. But that's kind of a one-shot deal. So one of the other things we did was to look to civil rights cases to say, okay, what has the civil rights community done in institutional cases? And created, we worked with the Office of Inspector General at HHS to create what we called monitoring agreements, to try and assure ongoing compliance and really to improve an industry. And how do you do that with both carrots and sticks? Is a not uncomplicated enterprise either, where the law is really important. I also had an opportunity to really kind of work with creating a body of case law. So we had AUSAs, Assistant United States Attorneys, all over the country bringing cases. And so we would try and keep track of those cases to figure out, okay, which of the cases are going to make good case law, which ones are going to make bad case law or are likely to. Where do we intervene and file briefs to try and shape the law so that it helps us achieve our goals? As I got more involved in the cases, I started to learn about forensic data and forensic evidence, which is where sort of the intersection of law and medicine. So, for example, in the child abuse field, there were decades of research showing that a spiral fracture or subdural hematomas are, indicative of abuse. We don't have any of that research in the elder abuse field. And so one of the things I did was to beg for money, essentially, to try and start funding research so we increased the knowledge. And it works on both sides in terms of proving cases, but also exonerating people who are wrongfully blamed for doing whatever, for beating up a nursing home resident, because often in these institutions, it's the person who has the least power who's accused of the wrongdoing, as opposed to going up the food chain to figure out where the responsibility is. Being in these big institutions that, in both the Department of Justice, working closely with HHS, and then being at the Senate, also taught me about the bully pulpit and the role of the bully pulpit, both in terms of raising awareness inside of the executive branch and the legislative branch, and then also, going out and talking about stuff, because these issues have had very few high-profile champions. There's pretty rampant ageism. There's pretty low level of knowledge about elder abuse, and not very many people talk about these issues at a high level. This year at the White House Conference on Aging, for the very first time ever, the words elder abuse escaped presidential lips. So then I looked to the Violence Against Women Act and the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act to see, okay, what have other fields done to try and get a handle on abuse, neglect, and exploitation issues? And one of the things that was really clear is not only did they get money appropriated, but they also created offices inside the executive branch, agencies, that where that money went, that, made sure that there was some research, some ongoing leadership, and institutional knowledge from generation to generation, administration to administration. So I thought, oh, that's a great idea. We'll just create offices. Well, it turned out that I got smacked down pretty fast on that. And so that was really initially what drove me to the Senate, to start talking to them and saying, look, we've got these laws that are models for other sorts of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. They've done a fair amount in those fields, never enough, but they've had a real impact. So maybe we could start talking about creating, writing an elder abuse law. And the woman with whom I worked and I, suffered really quite a delusion, thinking, oh, this is a slam dunk. We had really high-profile sponsors on both sides of the aisle. It wasn't a particularly politicized issue. And so, we were sort of choosing outfits for the signing ceremony. And that signing ceremony never really arrived. And, it turned out that no one was against it, but nobody was really for it either. And what you need, and really that's what sort of caused me to start rethinking what I had done, because a friend of mine who's really astute politically said, it's not good enough to have a good idea. It's a good idea, but you need a political constituency. And I didn't really even know what a political constituency was. Like, what does it mean to translate good ideas into action? And to, create a movement when it comes to an issue that's unpopular and that really people don't care about that much. And so that really changed how I thought about stuff. And it changed my thought about the role of prosecution, of defense, of law. So I'll just touch on a couple of those, and then I'll be quiet. In terms of the role of the law, what became really clear is that you can't prosecute your way out of a problem that's this substantial, and that's really a cultural problem. And so I shifted, and by the time prosecution rolls around, all the tears have been wept. So prosecutions do serve an important role in some situations for reasons we can discuss later, but I wanted to try and figure out how to use the law to prevent problems. And a lot of that is legal services, is matching up people with benefits, is, sort of the kinds of stuff that you might expect, but it's also, it's also raising awareness and trying to figure out how do we do that? How do you use the law to change systems more effectively? Because there's very little systemic advocacy in the aging field, and we haven't done a very good job. If you look back, and Charlie Halpern was actually the reason I went to law school. He used to teach at Georgetown Law School and is now at Berkeley, and started the Mental Health Law Project. And they did a really interesting and good job with mental health law in terms of clearing out institutions, but then sort of at the back end figuring out, how do you create a robust community mental health program. That never really happened so much. And so trying to figure out how do you use the law to change systems and then also deal with the aftermath is something that is still a work in progress. The mechanics of change are really complicated, and I feel like I'm just beginning to learn about them. But it also has to do with messaging, really, and figuring out like what messages resonate with what populations. So in doing that, I decided I wanted to start writing about these issues because there's no common vernacular to discuss elder abuse, really. And so my writing had pretty much been ruined by law and policy writing, which it kind of kills off any narrative lift. And really, the best way to write about stuff for for people to want to read it is storytelling. It's an extraordinarily effective means of litigating, of writing, of advocacy. And so that's that I think that's where I'll leave things. But going back to having legal training, it's really important to marry narrative with argument. You have to know where you want to end up, and you have to have really good infrastructure for the stories you tell. You need to know why you want to tell them and what you want to achieve, and then what you want to do with whatever energy you manage to generate. So that's that's sort of that's a quick arc, and
We'll have time for questions. That's terrific. Thanks, Marie-Therese. Margaret. All right, well, MT, I'm glad you mentioned the demographics because that's a lot of what's driven my work, issues relating to demographics. But I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle. I think, as you heard, I have a military background and also an immigration law background. And I have a public policy background. I went to the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and I got a master's in public policy. And I would say that it was both the law degree and the public policy background that made a difference to the work that the MacArthur Foundation recognized me for. And I'll tell you the story of a little bit of that work, and then you'll see how knowing about public policy, knowing about how bureaucracies work, how things work in the government for real rather than the theory, made a huge difference to my work and the success of my work. So we're supposed to tell you a little bit about the story and how we got here, and I guess my story starts, law school. I got the law degree. I went off to work for a private law firm. At the same time, I was an Army Reserve officer, so I was learning in my civilian job how to be a lawyer, and on the weekends I was in the Army Reserve and I was reinforcing my knowledge of the military. I'd long been a student of military history, which is one of the things that got me interested in the military. I wasn't a lawyer in the Army Reserve, I was a military police officer. So I was actually involved in law enforcement and sometimes just, I was a regular cop. So I had sort of that background and that angle and doing security work. But my journey towards the MacArthur Fellowship probably starts on 9/11. September 11, 2001, I was teaching classes at West Point that day. And if you know anything about the geography of the Hudson River, West Point's a famous bend on the Hudson River that was famous during the Revolution. It was a very strategic point for the American military, the Continental Army. And of course, today it's the United States Military Academy where future Army officers are educated. That morning I was teaching, and of course, all of a sudden the towers are getting hit with airplanes. And we learned later that the planes had flown down the Hudson River. They were using it as a navigational aid. So that's how they got to the towers, was they followed the Hudson River. And they had flown right over West Point. And because of the heights of West Point and the way the light refracts, we could see the towers burning from West Point. We knew when the second plane hit that it was definitely an attack. At that point in my career, I'm teaching military law, constitutional law, international law, those sorts of subjects at West Point, but I was also a very experienced immigration lawyer. And of course, if you know the story of 9/11, the immediate blame game started, and people said it instantly right after the attacks that because these folks are foreigners, it must be our immigration system that's to blame for these attacks. And as the story unfolded and we found out what happened, I realized that one of the reasons we got attacked is because we had very bad intelligence. We had all the information we needed to know sitting in US government files and in computers that we were going to get attacked. And yet we hadn't translated it because we didn't have enough translators. We hadn't looked at the information because the bureaucracy was not agile and wasn't expecting this kind of attack and that sort of thing. This really bothered me after 9/11, and it also bothered me because the immediate emotional response to the attacks was we need to shut our borders. The only way to protect ourselves is to make ourselves safe is to put up the walls, shut down, make a little enclave and keep all these bad people out of our country. And from my knowledge of military history and my knowledge of the United States, I knew that was absolutely the wrong approach. America did not get to be a superpower by putting up walls and keeping people out. And if you study military history and what makes countries great, it's basically three things: geography, resources, and population. And America had the magic formula as far as population goes, which is you borrow the best people from all the other countries in the world, and you give them some uniting ideal, and you get them to all work together. And that is an extremely powerful idea. We're not the first empire that ever tried that. The Romans figured it out, I think, before we did. But our immigration system has been a tremendous source of economic power and national security. And we had sort of forgotten about that. And 9/11 happened and we completely forgot about that. So it bothered me after 9/11 that we were forgetting what had made us a powerful country. We had forgotten that one of our strengths was the immigrants who want to come to America and they want to be part of this great thing that is the United States of America. And they're willing to work for us. And it had been our history that we had always won our wars by welcoming immigrants and figuring out, why are people attacking us? How do we stop them from attacking us? And that sort of thing. So I started writing papers about the national security aspects of immigration. And ultimately, as you know, this led to the MacArthur Fellowship. But the actual things that mean the most to me were not reflected in the papers, although the MacArthur people figured out that I had done these other things. And I want to kind of tell you a little bit more about that. The MacArthur folks said that I had done, 2013, they said I'd done 4 things. First thing was I'd written a lot of stuff about immigration and national security, and I kind of gave you the quick 30-second wrap of what my argument was. So I'd written a lot of papers, okay? Well, that's great, people write papers. But they said there were 3 things that I'd done that were practical. And these 3 things, sort of in order, were I started a pro bono program called the American Immigration Lawyers Association Military Assistance Program. I'll talk about that in a second. I restarted something that the U.S. government had done during the Vietnam War called Basic Training Naturalization. And then the third thing I'd done was a program called Military Accessions Vital to the National Interest, or MAVNI. All 3 of these practical things had something to do with immigration and national security. And I'll walk you through quickly kind of what the 3 things were, and then I'm going to focus on the last one, the MAVNI program, because to me that was the culmination of my professional career as an attorney. It's the most exciting thing I've ever done in my life, and it still boggles my mind that the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship people found out that I was the person behind this program, and and that was definitely the creative, super creative thing that I'd done that affected the most people. So American Immigration Lawyers Military Assistance Program, this grew out of the fact that after 9/11, I was one of the few people in the country who knew about national security law and immigration law. One of the few people working for the government who had any knowledge of immigration law at all. Most immigration lawyers are in private practice or they work for Homeland Security, but they don't really know the benefit side of immigration law. So I was getting inundated with phone calls from all kinds of people. I felt at times every soldier in the military who had an immigration problem was calling me or emailing me about something. And this happens because, as you know, the United States is a global power. We have soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. We send them all around the world. And I like to joke with people, when we send our people out, they don't sit on their cots at night and play solitaire. They are going out and they're interacting with people in the community. They're getting married, they're getting into relationships, they're having children, and pretty soon, one soldier who goes overseas for a 3-year tour wants to bring back his wife and his 3 kids and the grandmother and the aunt and the uncle. So we're importing, lots of people because we send people to foreign countries and they interact and get into relationships with folks. And this has always been the case, ever since the U.S. became a global military power. So the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines were all having problems with their family members. They couldn't get them in the country. They can't get a visa. The immigration system had gotten so complicated that it was impossible for the ordinary person to navigate it without the help of an attorney. The paperwork was too difficult, complicated. The questions they were asking, the amount of paperwork. If you filed the wrong thing in the wrong place, nothing happens for years and your papers get lost. So the legal immigration system was a big mess, and people were having a hard time figuring out how to comply with it. And they would go to JAG legal assistance offices for help, but the JAG lawyers didn't have the training necessary to help people in this highly technical area of the law. So they were calling me and asking me for help. And I was completely overwhelmed. And like a smart person, I said, I will go out and get some help. And how am I going to get help? I called the president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and I said, Chuck, you're patriotic. How about you set up a pro bono program and get all your lawyers? There's 10,000 members of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. How about we get them to volunteer to help these military people, because I just can't handle this. And Chuck said, let's do it. And we set up a listserv and we got lawyers to volunteer. We started matching people. And ultimately this became a very successful partnership between the legal assistance offices in the military and the American Immigration Lawyers Association. And today we have several hundred volunteer attorneys. We've helped thousands of people with their cases. And it's a win-win situation for everybody. And it's especially a big win for me because I got help. And now I can get rid of my work and get other people to do it for me, which is definitely a sign of genius. Okay. So that was one of the programs. And then the second one was basic training naturalization. And this is something I can't really take credit for, although I do take credit for getting it started in a way. The U.S. military has long had statutory authority to turn people into citizens immediately if they're serving in the United States military during wartime. How many of you have seen The Gangs of New York? Movie? Okay, all right. You might recall a very brief scene in The Gangs of New York where the Irishman is getting off the boat and somebody says, oh, you're signing up for the Union Army, raise your right hand, you're going to become an American citizen. Right, 30 seconds, he's in the Army and he's an American citizen. That's not actually far off from the reality. Now, today, of course, there's paperwork, you gotta file a form, you don't just get to raise your right hand and you're an American citizen, you have to do the paperwork. But the military has long had this special statute that kicks in wartime that says they can turn somebody into a citizen immediately, and Department of Homeland Security has to do it. They have to do all the paperwork and the processing. But they weren't using it after 9/11. The president had given them authority to use this law, but because people had forgotten that the law was there, they weren't using it. And this law essentially lets the United States military recruit anybody they want to in wartime and turn them into an American citizen in a very short period of time. The last time they had used this authority effectively had been during the Vietnam War, where they would recruit people, drafting them in many situations, and they would turn them into citizens before they went over to fight in Vietnam. So they would get citizenship at basic training. And the bureaucracy had pretty much forgotten that they had done that long ago, but they had done that in World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War. So after 9/11, I went to some folks in the bureaucracy and I said, why aren't you doing this? You could have done this, previously, 9/11, you could have started doing this. How come you're not doing it? And they said, well, we can't get the bureaucrats to cooperate over at the Pentagon in doing this. And I got told this by Homeland Security, that they would really like to naturalize soldiers at basic training, but they couldn't do it. They couldn't get the bureaucracy to cooperate. So I was the person that got the bureaucracy to cooperate. And I'm being videotaped, so I don't want to tell you exactly how I did it, but it's a good story, and it was, I guess, my use of my knowledge of public policy and how bureaucracies work that came in handy there. And I was able to match the Department of Homeland Security people that needed to get this program started, and also the people at the military that were able to implement it and make that match and make it happen. So today we have 4 services. There's 5 military services. 4 of them are doing basic training or boot camp naturalizations. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marine Corps. The Coast Guard, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, does not do boot camp naturalizations. And I'll just leave it at that. You can call them and ask them why they're not doing it. But this has been a very popular program, and it makes sense for the government, because if you don't naturalize people when they graduate from basic training in the military, you're sending foreigners overseas to fight for America, and that creates all sorts of really interesting international law problems. And you're law students, so you can think about what kind of international law problems there might be if you're a particular country's military and you're sending somebody to fight in a foreign country and they're not a citizen of your country. So basic training naturalization was designed to resolve that problem, along with some other problems that we were noticing in the post 9/11 era. So ALAMAP, the pro bono program, basic training naturalization. Now I get to the zinger. Military sessions vital to the national interest, which, like I said, was the kind of the culmination of my professional career. I was bothered after 9/11 by the fact that the U.S. military didn't have enough people who spoke foreign languages. And I was also noticing that because of demographics, the military was having really big recruiting problems. Think about it. Okay, if your population is aging rapidly, if you have increased criminality among youth, which we're seeing, if you have military enlistment standards that require people to be drug-free, crime-free, high school diploma, have to meet certain levels of educational standards, you are rapidly knocking most of the population out of eligibility for military service. And that was in fact the case. In fact, today, only 1 out of 5 Americans of military age can meet military enlistment standards. 1 out of 5. And that's because of drugs, crime, mental health issues, all sorts of things that you can think of. And the military's been facing a recruiting problem for more than a decade now. I also noticed that the military wasn't recruiting immigrants. And it wasn't because they couldn't recruit immigrants, it's because they didn't know how to. And it was a legal issue. So I was the one who, at one point in time, I just happened to be at a meeting, and I got 5 minutes, and I got to tell a general that he had the legal authority to recruit immigrants. He didn't need to go to Congress. He didn't need to get any laws passed. These laws were already on the books. Why didn't anybody notice these laws? Well, when you're a law student, you'll figure this out pretty quickly. The United States Code is huge, and nobody has read the whole thing. There's not a human being on the planet who has read the whole thing. Now, I was a technical expert in Title VIII, and I was an expert in Title X, and I think I was the only person in the whole country who had read Title VIII and Title X. And to figure out that you had the legal authority to recruit immigrants for the military, you had to read both Title VIII and Title X, and nobody had ever done that except me. So all I had to do was put up a section of Title VIII and a section of Title X and say, look how these fit together, okay? And I remember the Secretary of the Army looking at me when I was explaining this, and he goes, I can do that? And I go, yes, sir, you can do that. And he was amazed because his lawyers had never told him about this section of Title VIII and Title X and how they fit together. So it's nothing more joyful as a lawyer when you find two laws and it's like very creative to show people what you can do with the law, if you just put it together. It was very cool. So what came out of this was a program to recruit people who spoke foreign languages, who were already in the U.S. legally, but because of our difficult, complicated, messed up immigration system, they couldn't get green cards. And this is a shock to many people, but we have millions of immigrants in the United States today who are perfectly legal, but they can never get a green card because our system doesn't let them. They're either not qualified for one, they can't ever qualify, or they're on a 10-year, 15, 20-year waiting list for a green card. Many of them are probably here at BC right now. They're in an F1 visa status or a J1 or some other visa status that, they're perfectly legal, but they're not getting a green card anytime soon. So my idea was simply, let's accelerate this process of integrating them into America. They're already here, they're going to school here, perfectly legal. Give them a chance to join the United States military and they can get their citizenship right away, immediately. And many of these folks will welcome the opportunity to avoid a 10, 15, 20-year wait for a green card and go straight to American citizenship if we give them the opportunity to do that. So this turned into Military Accessions Vital to the National Interest. It's a program run today mainly by the Army, Air Force, and the Navy. But this fiscal year, they're recruiting 5,000 people. They can join the Army Reserve, so they can keep working for their civilian employer, and they can keep going to BC Law School. There's an F1 student here that's interested in the program. You can continue to do your civilian job, but on the weekends, you go off and do what I used to do, which is join the Army Reserve. You go on to your weekend training at, Fort Devens or whatever, and you do your 2 weeks in the summer. You can also choose to go on active duty, but the deal is that you get American citizenship immediately. You don't have to worry about getting a green card. And that turnaround, that allows you to turn around and get your relatives in the country almost immediately, your spouse and your children if you should have them. This program has been highly successful, I would say wildly successful. I was told it was the most successful recruiting program in the history of the military. And I'll give you a couple of examples of people we recruited through this program. We recruited Saral Shretha, the U.S. Army Soldier of the Year for 2012. He was a computer science student studying in Nebraska in an F1 student visa status. He joined the Army under this program, MAVNI, became an American citizen, and then he became the U.S. Army Soldier of the Year through a rigorous competition. We recruited an MIT nuclear physics, nuclear policy student. He was from Nepal also. He looked ahead and realized that he had an F1 student visa, and if he wanted to actually work in his field, he was going to have to get a green card, which is going to be difficult, and then wait 5 years to get American citizenship. And so he wouldn't be able to work in the United States in his field, given the security clearances and so forth required, probably for 10 or 15 years. So he left MIT. They gave him a leave of absence. He was supposed to be getting a PhD, but they gave him a leave of absence. He joined the Army. The Army made him a citizen. He's now an officer in the United States Army using his MIT degrees to work for the greater national security of the United States of America. And my last quick story, because I know you've got to go. We recruited by accident lots of athletes. This program was for people who spoke foreign languages, but it turns out there are a lot of top-notch athletes in America who speak Swahili. And that was one of our strategic languages that we were trying to recruit. So in recruiting people who spoke foreign languages, we got some very positive second and third order side effects. And I'll just tell you about one of them. Augustus Mayo, NCAA All-American runner, Crimson Tide. When he graduated from Crimson Tide, of course, he was looking at the U.S. immigration system and going, forget it, I guess I'm going to have to go back to Kenya. There's no way to easily get a green card or a visa to stay in the country if you're just a really super fantastic runner. So he joined the Army, and the Army knew they had something special because at basic training he started lapping people on the 2-mile run. So the Army sent him to the Army World Class Athlete Program in Colorado Springs so he could, run a lot more. And then they decided to send him to his first half marathon ever. This was the San Antonio Rock and Roll Half Marathon in San Antonio, Texas. First one he'd ever run in his life for a record. 1 hour and 4 minutes. He won the half marathon with an Army jersey on. And so the Army said, well, this guy can run long distances, let's send him to a marathon. So they sent him to his first marathon ever, which was the Marine Corps Marathon in 2012. I have a picture of him wearing an Army jersey and breaking the tape at the Marine Corps Marathon. It says United States Marine Corps, and he's wearing an Army jersey, so that's really good, right? Also, the Marine Corps was not participating in the MAVNI program. So he won the Marine Corps Marathon that year. There's nobody behind him at all in the picture. He was a little slow because Hurricane Sandy was rolling in that day and there was a headwind, but I think he 2 hours and 17 minutes, something like that. And nobody behind him. And then this year, 2 other MAVNIs won the Marine Corps Marathon. Well, one came in first and one came in second. One was from Kenya and one was from Uganda. So we, in addition to getting some really serious language skills for the United States military, we also got some tremendous athletic talent. And if the U.S. Olympic Committee finds out about this, I think they're going to probably give me a Genius Award too, but I'll leave it for that. So I want to stop there and just tell you about those things. And I will say that, it really was both the law degree and the public policy education, because with the MAVNI program, I had to get a project through the Pentagon. And if you know anything about the Pentagon, you know that it's a very difficult place to penetrate if you've ever read about it. I was told when I started working on the MAVNI program that I had to get approval from the secretary of one of the services in order to get it through. And so I went to see a friend of mine who was a former service secretary. And he, I thought, would be able to tell me how long it's going to take me to get this through the Pentagon. And he looked at me after I briefed him on my project and he said, "Margaret, it's a great idea. It's a wonderful idea, but the Pentagon crushes great ideas." He said, "It'll take you," and I don't think he said, "I don't think you're going to achieve this." He said, I think it probably will fail, but if you achieve this, it's going to take you at least 5 years." So I started working on it in January 2008, and I'm happy to report that the Secretary of Defense signed off on the project in November 2008. I don't have time to tell you how that happened, but it did require me to use all of the skills I had learned as a law student and a student of bureaucracy in order to achieve that result. And it's something I'm very proud of, and I think it's something that I had no idea when I was in law school that I'd be able to do that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. John.
All right. How's everyone doing? So one of the great lawyers in America said, Charles Hamilton Houston, that a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. And I love that. And so I want to start there and say I want to thank the Rappaport Institute, Mike, Lissy, for inviting us and for inviting you all, because I think there's really nothing more important we could be doing in law school than helping you all think about what you're passionate about, because there is a direct connection between pursuing your passion and being a social engineer. So I start off, I do orientation for law students every year. And I start off asking these new law students who are like sort of a little bit bewildered and a little bit bright-eyed, and I say, "Why are you here?" And most of them will raise their hands and say things like, "I believe in justice. I want to change the world. I want to do something for my community." And I then share with them one of my favorite quotes, which is by an unnamed law student. It says, "The first thing I lost in law school was the reason why I came." I tell them, you're about to enter, right? You're nodding your heads. You're law students. You know what I'm talking about. You enter your first year. I tell them you're going to enter a first-year curriculum, and we will teach you that the law is about rules and doctrine, that it's reduced to black letters on white pages. You will quickly forget that there are people behind these cases. And before you know it, if you're not careful, you'll be on this conveyor belt, ushering you towards a career that, while maybe lucrative, is meaningless. Right? And so the first thing I really want to say to you is thank you for just being here, thinking about how you can make a difference as a lawyer. If there's one thing that I think any lawyer who's ever won the MacArthur Fellowship or any lawyer that's ever done anything meaningful has ever done, that one thing that we have in common is that we have thought about where our passion is. Right? So I'll start by saying that. So my passion coming out of law school was to be a public defender. I started my career as a public defender in Washington, D.C., one of the offices considered a model office in the country, not because the lawyers there are necessarily better than other public defenders, but it's an office that is well-resourced, figured out how to keep caseloads manageable. And so I spent 10 years learning how to be a really good public defender. And then I got invited to move to Georgia. In 2004, Georgia was in the process of establishing a statewide public defender system. Up until then, 159 counties all decided on their own how to fulfill the mandate, the 1963 Supreme Court mandate, Gideon v. Wainwright, that every state must ensure a person accused of a crime, a felony, since been extended to misdemeanors, to juvenile cases, is provided a lawyer. 159 counties decided in a patchwork system how to do it. Georgia was starting a statewide system. I went there to become the training director. Spent 2 years there. After 2 years, Hurricane Katrina hit in New Orleans, and I was invited to come to New Orleans to help with the effort to rebuild that public defender office. I did some work in Alabama. I did some work in Mississippi. And what I saw in all of these places, something I hadn't seen in 10 years in D.C., I saw criminal justice systems that had come to accept embarrassingly low standards of justice for poor people. Everyone in the system had come to accept these low standards of justice. And I started to meet these young lawyers who were like me coming out of law school, passionate, enthusiastic, wanted to change the world, and they would go into these systems, and the systems would literally beat the passion out of them. And within a few years, they would either quit or they would become resigned to the status quo, and they would start processing people. A quick story that sort of illustrates this. The first time I walked into a courtroom in New Orleans, there were people everywhere in suits. You didn't know who the defenders were. You didn't know who the prosecutors were, because no one was sort of tethered to a particular table. You knew who the judge was. He was in the robe. And you knew who the accused were because they were in orange jumpsuits shackled against the wall. And the judge started calling cases. And a name would loft up from the suits. You didn't know what suit a voice would loft up. You didn't know what suit the voice was attached to. No one in a suit ever stood next to anyone in an orange jumpsuit. And within 10 seconds, they'd be on to the next case. And they just started processing people. And then the judge called a name and there was no voice. And the judge turned to the orange jumpsuits and said, "Is Mr. So-and-so here?" And a man stood up. And he said, "Sir, where's your lawyer?" The man said, "I haven't seen a lawyer since I got locked up." And the judge said, "Well, how long have you been locked up?" The man said, 70 days. The judge said, "Thank you, sir, sit down," and went on with the processing. And what was more shocking to me than the fact that a man was locked up for 70 days without a lawyer in America was that no one in that courtroom was fazed. Not the judges, not the prosecutors, not the defenders who were tasked with speaking for these men. And what I really came to understand when I started doing this work across the South is that there is a culture. There is a culture of injustice that takes good people and turns them into lawyers they never, ever thought they would become. And as I studied criminal justice reform, in particular indigent defense, public defense reform, I learned that we were talking about two categories of reform exclusively. We talked about resources. We need more money. We talked about structural challenges. Structural challenges include things like part-time public defenders who get a set amount of money to handle a set number of cases and make most of their money with private cases. So there's a real disincentive to invest any time more than necessary with your public defender cases. Structural problems are things like systems that say we will pay you $50 a case, whether you plead it out tomorrow or whether you have a week-long trial, and the disincentives that creates. So we talk about financial reform, we talk about structural reform. No one was talking about cultural reform. And I became convinced that until we change this culture, until we change the assumptions that drive criminal justice professionals, we could never have meaningful reform. So I got together with my wife, who is not a lawyer, but in many ways probably better equipped to build an organization like Gideon's Promise, because my wife at the time was an educator. She'd been a school teacher working in urban settings, first Washington, D.C., then Atlanta. But even more relevant, she grew up in Buffalo, New York. And her father went to prison when she was 5 years old for a series of bank robberies he had committed years earlier. 10 years had passed, he'd gotten married, he had 4 young children, he'd completely changed his life, he converted to Islam, but the police caught up with him. and he was given a public defender who never told his story, who never shared the new life that he'd developed. And as a result, he went to prison for 10 years, and my wife and her 3 younger siblings grew up without a father. She had to raise her brother, who's now in federal prison. Every man in her family had been to prison. And she left Buffalo, New York, thinking, I can't stand public defenders. I'm going to become a teacher. I'm going to interrupt that cycle on the front end. And she then went into education, where she saw kids who came to school with no chance. She had a student, a 5-year-old student in Washington, D.C. His nickname was Little Lorton. Lorton is the prison in D.C. His mother called him Little Lorton. And so she felt a little helpless there. And when we got the opportunity to start Gideon's Promise, by then she had met young public defenders who were passionate, who were committed, and she came to believe, as I do, that public defenders serve as the voice for people at the last stage of the cradle to prison pipeline. And if we can empower that group to change a criminal justice narrative that is chewing people up and spitting them out, we have a chance. And so the 2 of us started Gideon's Promise. To correct Mike slightly, we started Gideon's Promise before I came to John Marshall. John Marshall has been very welcoming and has embraced Gideon's Promise, but we started Gideon's Promise independent of my teaching at John Marshall. And what Gideon's Promise was started to do was to start to not just train public defenders, but to attract young lawyers to places where the need is the greatest, to provide them training and support, not only to be better lawyers immediately and to start raising the standard of practice immediately, but to develop into a movement of public defenders to drive criminal justice reform where the need is the greatest. We started with 16 lawyers in 2 offices, New Orleans and Atlanta. We've since grown into a movement of over 400 public defenders from over 40 partner offices across 15 states. That doesn't include a recent partnership with the state of Maryland that touches over 500 public defenders. And when MT talked about the importance of learning narrative and the importance of learning storytelling, I couldn't agree more, because I think what we are really doing in many ways, and I'm a law school teacher, I don't mean to be too harsh on law schools, but we should be somewhat harsh on law schools, because outside of clinics, outside of teachers who really are committed to preparing you all to practice, outside of institutes like this one, we don't always do a good job of preparing people to care about other people who have no access to justice. We often teach people how to be lawyers at the expense of being people. And so what I say is, frequently what we're doing is we're trying to unteach you 3 years of forgetting what it's like to care. And so we teach you to be storytellers. And we teach you that to be a storyteller, you have to learn who your client is, not just what they're charged with, but who they are as a person. You have to then go into court or schools or criminal justice meetings or any forum you have access to and start changing a narrative that sees our clients as less than human and sees us as unworthy of respect. We've all seen the image of the bumbling public defender on television. It's rare you see the public defender as the most heroic and noble person in the system, which I think is what Gideon said. In 1963, Gideon said that the lawyer is the engine essential to ensure justice, that no one can maneuver a complex system of laws and procedure without a lawyer. And while Gideon didn't say it, it was a case about equal justice. When you ask what kind of lawyer, therefore, do poor people deserve, it seems to me obvious, the kind that you and I would pay for. If we care about equal justice, then we have to make sure poor people have the kinds of lawyers that we would pay for. And so what we are doing is building an army of lawyers to change that narrative, to remind judges and prosecutors and sadly other defenders who have, quite frankly, sometimes lost their way, of how important it is to respect the role of the lawyer and to respect the dignity of the people in the system. So we started as a program for new lawyers. We have a 3-year program for new lawyers where it's ongoing training, mentorship. We bring lawyers together for a 2-week boot camp. We send them off to their offices across the South, and increasingly we're piloting beyond the South. We've got a partnership in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Lincoln, Nebraska, Rochester, New York, and we are sending folks to their offices. We then connect them with mentors. We have an electronic community so they stay in touch. They get together every 6 months for follow-up training and community building. And when they come together, they meet up with the rest of the community, and they're integrated into the community. And that happens for 3 years. And then they graduate. Well, in 2011, we realized we were starting to graduate. 2010, we were graduating our first class. And we thought, well, now what happens? If they go back into the system that has this perverse set of values and they no longer have support, they're going to backslide. And we started a graduate program where we now bring our graduates in for 3 years to learn to be trainers and mentors and to reinforce the community. We started a leadership program to bring chief defenders from our partner offices together every 6 months to partner with them to think about how to support these lawyers and how themselves to better advocate for reform in their jurisdictions. We have a law clerk program, so law students like you, who if you were like me when I was in law school and I knew I wanted to be a public defender, there were a handful of offices on my radar. And so we've now opened a pipeline to dozens of offices. And we have law clerk programs that give law students an opportunity to work in those offices and see what they're like. And we have a trainer development program where we train trainers around the country to export the model. So let me wrap up by saying this. I really do think it's building a movement. I think lawyers are a critical piece of any movement to reform criminal justice. What I frequently like to say is over the last year, because of very unfortunate circumstances, I believe our country has been awakened to a tragic reality, and that is that equal justice in America does not exist. Right? Just over a year ago, we learned about the shooting death of Michael Brown in Ferguson. Not long after that, we learned about the killing of Eric Garner in New York. And since then, there have been countless videotaped killings of mostly people of color. 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio. Freddie Gray in Baltimore. Samuel DuBose in Cincinnati. Sandra Bland down in Texas. Walter Scott, North Charleston. I could go on and on and on. And I think what these highly publicized extreme examples of abusive policing have shown the country is that we don't care about some communities as much as others. But what I frequently like to say is that for every person killed by a police officer, tens of thousands are arrested. They're thrown into a criminal justice system where they are given a public defender who, as heroic as they may be, they are overwhelmed, under-resourced, beaten down. Those people will get processed through that system into a cell, and if they get out, they oftentimes will not be able to return to their homes, to their jobs. They'll get deported. They won't be able to vote. They won't be able to get educational loans. It's routine injustice that's not captured on videotape that is crippling far more communities than these more highly publicized examples of extreme abuse. And as a nation, we are finally starting to talk about criminal justice reform. But there's a piece missing. We talk about sentencing reform. We talk about decriminalizing minor behavior. But we don't talk about the critical role of public defenders, the men and women who speak for 80% of the people in the system. And I think what we believe at Gideon's Promise is these lawyers who speak for 80% of the people, we have to see them as more than just lawyers who represent one individual in an isolated case at a time. They do that, and that's important. But collectively, they are the voice of a community of people who have gone unheard. Collectively, they have the power to change a criminal justice narrative that has accepted abusive practices that disproportionately impact people of color and almost exclusively impact poor people. And so, to me, building this movement seemed like a natural extension from being a public defender in a well-resourced office to seeing what it's like in offices that really aren't very well-resourced, and starting to find support for lawyers who do this work. It's that work that really led to the MacArthur Fellowship, and I think the biggest benefit from the MacArthur Fellowship is it's validated our approach to indigent defense reform and criminal justice reform. It has caused more people to look and say, you're right. We do need to address the cultural issues, and public defenders are certainly an important vehicle in doing that. I'm going to end where I started by saying this. I love quotes. So I'm going to share another quote with you. One of my favorite quotes is, "Every day you write your epitaph." And I say this to lawyers because I am a law professor as well, and I talk to a lot of third-year law students who come to me when they realize they have no idea what they want to do with their lives. And they're feeling panicked, not only because of their debt, but because they feel like they haven't found their passion. And I love that quote, "Every day you write your epitaph," because every day it's not about how much money you make. Every day you are taking one more step towards writing your own story. The story about who you are and who you'll be remembered as, and how pleased you'll be with your life when you're on your deathbed. And so I end where I started, which is thank you to the Rappaport Center and to you all for inviting us here. Thank you for creating a forum for students to get together and think about how you can contribute to the world, right? You don't plan to get a MacArthur Fellowship. You go out and you do good work because that's what is important to you. And when you do that, good things happen to you and good things happen to the people that you touch. And so thank you for coming, and I hope that we continue to be able to touch each other as you grow in your profession.
Thanks so much. Those were terrific remarks. Thanks, everybody. I have a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the panel. But you touched upon it a little bit at the end, John, when you talk about you don't apply for a MacArthur Fellowship. It actually is unlike other fellowships. You do not apply. You are secretly nominated. I don't know if people know this, but you are secretly nominated and secretly chosen. I'm wondering if you could just say a few words about how you found out you got it, who you were allowed to tell, if you even knew you were in the process of getting it, and how long before that you knew it was a possibility. Anybody want to talk about that, the process of?
You want to start?
Why don't you start?
I don't get things I apply for.
You don't know how refreshing that is for students to hear, MT.
No, it's true. You know, I mean, we didn't get here because we work on winning causes particularly.
Right.
You get, I mean, it really is what John said. It's a kind of, it's a kind of devotion to what most people consider to be futile causes. And just, being willing to smash yourself up into walls again and again until you, and then these completely Byzantine institutions. I think as both of you reflected, it is for people, for artists, it's one thing, they get to keep doing their work. I think for the likes of us, it's a validation of the issues we work on, because really, they're not giving a whole lot of these to people who are, representing people of means. And it really is forgotten issues or hidden issues. And I thought I was hallucinating. I was sure it was a prank when I got the call. I was like, no, this, it can't be true. I thought they were calling me for a reference for somebody else. So.
Did you ever learn who nominated you?
I have some idea, but
they don't tell you that.
Oh, no.
Oh, interesting.
So, no, they the whole thing is shrouded in mystery. So, but I do think, I think the really important thing, and whenever I have an opportunity to talk to foundations and even government funders, I think the really important point is the power of philanthropy, because people who have the power to give away money make statements, and it isn't just the money that you get. it's something way more important, because because foundations, by giving you money, even stuff you do apply for, that people I'm very envious of get, they validate that you're working on something that matters. And so I think that that's an important message for, for people who have the power to give away money to hear again and again.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I do remember the moment when they called, because I saw the phone call coming in from Chicago, and I thought it was this lawyer who was constantly calling me for help with a case. And I remember briefly thinking, oh no, not again. I'm going to be on the phone for 45 minutes. But I took the call because, I was like, okay, I should talk to this lawyer. And it wasn't. It was somebody else calling, and I was, I remember being puzzled, and I had this brief flash of, oh, this is a practical joke, because I actually have a lot of friends who play practical jokes on me all the time. So, that I still don't know today who nominated me. I'd love to find out so I can thank the person, but I have no idea. I echo what you said. The most exciting thing about it was how validated all the other immigration lawyers felt by this. Because it was like suddenly our field of law is like respectable, and like what we're doing, deserves recognition. And we all knew we were down in the trenches, like fighting for people. And I guess the most gratifying thing to me was actually came from my spouse, because he had been complaining for years about my irregular work habits. I'm down in the basement at 4 a.m. in my pajamas talking to some soldier who's crying on the phone, about his wife getting deported or whatever. And I've been doing this for years, and I was just constantly doing it. And my husband had banished me to the basement because he wanted to sleep. And when I told him about this, you're allowed to tell one person before they make the big announcement. Of course, I told my husband. He looked at me and he said, "You really deserve that," which,
That's so great.
was, yeah. So anyway, go on.
That is great. So I learned about it. I was in Baltimore, actually. We were doing a 2-week training for new public defenders, and I got the call. It was like 5 p.m., and I remember they said to me, "Are you sitting down?" I later asked them why they asked if I was sitting down, and they told me because apparently, maybe this was made up, but apparently someone was driving when they were told, and they thought that wasn't really a good idea because they were so excited they thought maybe that wasn't safe. So they wanted to make sure I was in a safe place, first of all. I also thought it was a prank. They told me I could tell one person. I said, "My wife?" And they said, "That's what we'd recommend." So I told my wife. And then they said they wanted to come make a video, but they had to do it in the next few days because they were going to announce in a couple of weeks, and they wanted a video of every recipient. And so they wanted to come to Maryland and make a video. So I had to come up with some story for all of these people in the public defender office in Maryland, why there'd be these cameras following me around shooting video. And so I told them there was some video they wanted to make about Gideon's Promise. But I will echo, at the risk of being redundant, matter of fact, not only the risk of being definitely being redundant, it was really validating, I think, for our community of lawyers, for public defenders. The calls I got from public defenders saying congratulations and how pleased they were that someone was recognizing the work meant more to me than many of the other calls I got from so many people who many folks would sort of think of as more important. I don't think anyone's more important than the lawyers that we work with, and so it meant an incredible amount to me to get those calls.
Can I add one other-
My wife didn't tell me I deserved it. She said she deserved it.
Right, my husband says, "I married a genius and she married a dumbass like me. Who does that make the genius?"
Love it.
The other thing I think that happens for people who do the kind of work that we do is, at least for me, it's meant that I feel a huge responsibility, because really, it sounds like a platitude, but, we stand on the shoulders of a lot of other people and work with a lot of people. And so at least I feel like I share this with a whole field of other people. And that's both, that it's both validating, but it's also kind of a curse, because you think, oh God, what's my next trick to show that actually they didn't screw up and make a mistake. And so, it's a complicated thing too when you're part of when you're either part of a movement or trying to instigate one.
So one more question I'll ask, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. But I note there's some consistency in your biographies in that at one point you all worked for the government. You've received these MacArthur Awards that are supposed to allow you the freedom to be creative. And I just wanted to ask whether, in your view, there's any inconsistency between government work and creativity as lawyers. Whether you view your experience with the government as formative and important in your careers, or whether that's not the reason that you are where you are today.
Well, I couldn't have done what I did without working for the government. I think I've always been sort of the outsider in the government, though. I went to the wrong school. I'd go to West Point. I was an Army officer, went to Harvard. That people always thought that was weird.
First time in history, anyone will
Yeah,
call Harvard the wrong school.
Not really. People were always sort of skeptical, like, why are you in the Army? That kind of thing. But working for the government was absolutely critical because that's how I learned how the government works and how to push the buttons. My education in public policy was really important. I still remember a book I read as an undergraduate that was just an eye-opener, Bureaucracy, James Q. Wilson. And I remember reading that, and if there's one book, if you ever want to work for the government, go read that book. Because I learned how bureaucracies are irrational, how they have cultures, they do things a certain way because they've done it that way the whole time. And, in order to get the bureaucracy to move, you really have to have worked for it. And you also have to understand the theory and why bureaucracies behave the way they do. So that book, and then Graham Allison, The Essence of Decision, was another one that was just a big eye-opener that I read as an undergraduate that really, informed my efforts to get things done. So I think it was extremely valuable to work for the government. In fact, I think if you want to accomplish something in government, you really need to know how it works. And the only way you're ever going to learn how it works is to be there and experience it yourself. So at some level, you have to have some background to get the government moving. And, we're not going to really talk politics here today, but I'm always skeptical of people that think they can just instantly, make the government do something different. You can't. You have to know how it works, and if you have no experience in that, you're going to be inevitably disappointed.
Either of you want to comment on that question, or should I open it up?
Well, I'll just say, I guess, I assume when you say I worked for many years ago I did 2 years at the Federal Reserve Board, but I assume that's not what you're talking about.
No, I'm talking about being
a public defender.
Yeah, your paycheck
So-
came from the government.
So being a public defender is kind of a unique sort of way to work for the government, because you work for the government because they have to employ you. Even if they don't want to, the Constitution says they have to pay for lawyers for poor people. Some governments, in fact, say, we don't want to do it, we're going to boot it to a lower government. And so states will say, we'll put it on counties. But it's working for the government, but in many ways it's working for the government to oppose the government, at least to the extent that what they're trying to do is funnel people into cells quickly, right? It is really pushing back against the government and calling them out when they are not doing what the Constitution demands of protecting the rights of the most vulnerable. So while I guess I worked for the government, I never really felt like a government employee, so I certainly don't see any inconsistency.
And I did work for the Department of Justice for many years, and for a judge, and felt like, and then I guess I was at the Senate too. So I worked for all three branches of federal government and found it an invaluable experience, both because of what Margaret was talking about in terms of learning how to navigate, and also, sort of developing a healthy kind of better to ask forgiveness than permission. Because you both have to, you have to know how the rules work in order to either evade or break them, and or how to push the right levers. Because you're also there. I mean, that's sort of my bully pulpit point, which is that, they also have, in Janet Reno and Eric Holder, really, very prominent people who were relatively sympathetic. And so if you can use the institution as a lever to raise awareness and to funnel both both human resources and money to a particular issue, that's a very powerful thing. And so you as an individual are much more powerful because of the institution that you work for, if you can figure out sort of a combination of pressure and cajoling, because you don't win by just breaking all the rules or being an asshole, basically. But so it's a very delicate combination of skills, I think, in terms of how you use big institutions to achieve important goals.
Terrific. Questions from the audience?
We can't have been that clear.
Hi.
Hi, I'd like to ask all three panelists if they could tell us a little bit about what they're doing with the money from the conference, please.
So, for me, I will tell you, trying to build a nonprofit has proven to be incredibly challenging. And there are many days when we thought about just closing the doors. And in particular, because my wife and I both work in the nonprofit, it creates a real stress, and we're building a staff, and that becomes very stressful. So for me, what the MacArthur Award has done, it's given us a cushion that we have sitting in a bank that we are waiting to use as we need it. It's a cushion, so when we feel like we need to close the doors, we can use a little bit of money to keep them open. But we don't have a plan other than to say, let's see when we need it. And fortunately, in the last year, we haven't needed it.
It's basically let me take a lot of pro bono cases and do a lot more policy work than I could do otherwise. I'm a retired reservist, and we don't get paid by the government. I retired from the Army Reserve after 28 years, but the way the Army Reserve works is they don't give you any money when you retire. You have to wait till you're 65 if Congress lets us. They might jack up the retirement age. I'm quite a ways from 65, so I don't get a paycheck from the government anymore, and I run a small law firm. So what I've done with the money essentially is, instead of working on stuff that I would normally have to work on to make a living, I work on things that are my passions. One big issue I'm working on right now is deported veterans. A lot of Americans are completely unfamiliar with the concept that we deport military veterans. But we've recruited lots of people over the years, and before we had basic training naturalization, many of the people recruited, mostly green card holders, didn't get their citizenship at basic training, and they often got discharged from the military without their citizenship, and then later on got deported. So I spend a lot of time now working with deported vets. Most of them have no money. A lot of them vast majority have criminal histories. They're outside the country. I try to do things like give them free file reviews to try to figure out if there's something that can be done to overturn their deportation order. I try to get them matched up with lawyers who can help them. Sometimes I represent them. So I'm doing a lot more pro bono work than I could reasonably afford to do if I didn't have the MacArthur Fellowship.
And I'm using mine to both try and finish a book that I'm working on, and do policy work that's generally unpaid, and try and keep the home fires burning. And we have 2 kids in college, so it's.
Thank you.
Other questions? Sharon?
So first of all, I want to thank you all for coming. You really demonstrated the power of narrative, because yourselves and your personal stories, and the way you talk about circumstances in your life, like a sick kid, right? And then who knows what you took a different route instead of the route you were going to take, and it led you to an amazing place. But you never know that about the ups and the downs and the bends. So I think my question is really prompted by something you said, MT, which is talking about the reality of having to build a political constituency and the challenges of that. And I'm thinking about that in large part about Jonathan's work, because I've heard it said many times that there's no political constituency for indigent defense, right? That's why there are too many federal judges on the bench who have the kinds of experience that you have and the work that your colleagues have. And so I guess I wanted to ask both of you, how's it going with that part of it? So how's it going with building how do you do that? And is that part of what you're still trying to do? And do you partner with people to do that, or?
Do you want to go for it?
Well, so yeah, that's a wonderful point. There really is not a political constituency for indigent defense, in as far as we see indigent defense as being about criminals, particularly criminals who commit violent offenses. I think, again, going back to my criminal justice narrative, I think we've accepted a narrative in this country that most of the 2.2 million people locked up in America at any given time, by the way, we have 5% of the world's population, 25% of its prison population. We've bought into this narrative. I was just showing my students last night in my criminal procedure class some political campaigns for judges out of Nebraska, Illinois, and West Virginia. And all of these are campaigns that show that these judges ruled in favor of someone convicted of a crime, and they'd have someone saying, I slashed 10 people's throats, I raped 10 children, and these judges let me go home, right? And it's as long as that's the image, there won't be a constituency. So what we've been doing is helping people understand that really people in the criminal justice system are much more like your neighbors, the person who served you coffee this morning at your local coffee shop, the person who bags your groceries. They're people's sons and daughters and husbands and wives and mothers and fathers, that most of us in America are literally a paycheck away from needing a public defender. And if we don't have a good lawyer, could be processed into a prison cell ourselves. We've been trying to expand that narrative of who it is who's impacted by the system by partnering with community organizations. So we have a partnership with the Southern Christian Leadership Council in Cobb County, Georgia. We've been working with a lot of local churches. We have been working with 100 Black Men of Atlanta. We've been trying to work with organizations that have connections and tentacles in communities that are most impacted by the criminal justice system, who can help us tell the story of who's being impacted. And quite frankly, most people, particularly people of color, but most people know someone impacted by the criminal justice system. So the trick is, how do we get you to see those in the system more like the folks you know and not like the people on these ads for judges?
In answer to your question, very, very slowly. And I think partially because we're not very good students of how change happens. I don't think we teach it well enough. I don't think we understand it well enough. And those of us who are trying to wring change out of broken systems, are so, we're so frantic a lot of the time that we don't go about it as methodically as we might. I have a friend who is in a very, runs a very powerful foundation, and one of the things he wants to do is essentially provide advocacy training for the people who come to him for money, so that they spend the dollars well. So I think that we can't understate it, especially for a population like the one John is dealing with that doesn't elicit a ton of reflexive sympathy. But also, for the populations that Margaret and I work with, who maybe are a little bit higher on the sympathy scale. But we really, as a people, we love blame. We love to be able to blame somebody else for whatever else is wrong. And it's a narrative that runs through all of these different problems, and you want to be able to shift it to somebody else. And it's okay to blame certain populations, but not other populations. Certain crimes are heinous automatically, others much less so. And so I think that it's something for essentially anybody who cares about public interest to really focus on a lot more, and to bring in political strategists and communications people and people who do this stuff at high levels. I mean, if you look at how political campaigns work, I mean, it's astounding what they know and what they do, and they know so much about us and how you're going to react to things. So these things are amenable to a lot more change than we have elicited. So I think it's a really important question, and something that I would encourage both students and centers like yours to focus on.
Maybe time for one more question. Any other questions, Justin?
So, my question is, each of you are geniuses.
That's a question? That's a statement.
There'll be a question mark.
It's
so
a question.
If not for your respective fields, what else would you work on? You become experts in veteran issues, immigration, elder abuse, and public defense. But there's only so much time in the day. So for all of us who are looking for other public interest areas? Where do you see another need? Or what would your other passion be?
Wow. That's, well, so we're all stymied, I think.
If you had a do-over,
At
what
least
would you
I'm
do?
stymied,
Right.
and I think it's because it's so hard for me to imagine my life not completely steeped in this issue, right? In so many ways, my whole identity is tied into the work that I've been doing. And so in many ways, you're sort of asking if you could rebrand yourself from day. It's hard for me to go back and think about that. I mean, there are lots of issues that move me that I think are important. Education is a really important issue, and I think there's a great connection between education and the criminal justice system. But I often think if Gideon's Promise closed tomorrow, I'd take up fishing or crochet or something. Like, I don't know that I'd have the energy to start again with something else. So I don't know that, I can't answer your question. That's a terrible thing to do as a panelist.
Well, I think a great form of advocacy is the novel. And if I, for some reason, could not do what I do tomorrow, I would sit down and write a novel about it, which would be turned into a major Hollywood motion picture. And, I'm not sure who would star in it, but it would be an incredibly fun and exciting movie that you all would want to go see, and then you'd all want to be a lawyer like me, right? No, I'm just kidding.
So interesting that you say that, because I also, right now I am writing about the issues I'm working on, but I would like to expand beyond that. So that's not so much a public interest thing, but your question made me think about a way that I've been thinking about how you organize your life. And I see it horizontally and vertically, that you learn a whole lot about one issue. In my case, I learned a lot about one issue, and really it was like a second career, because I was a government lawyer doing fraud cases, really. So I learned a lot about one issue, and then that becomes a platform sort of for horizontally doing a whole lot of different stuff on that one issue. And I think all of us have sort of experienced that. Whereas when I was a government lawyer, I did fraud cases, and so I learned a little bit about the Department of Defense, a little bit about the GSA, and Medicare and Medicaid fraud, and how grants work, and Department of Education. So that felt like a sort of that was a generalist when I was a specialist in process, as opposed to being an expert in one substantive area, and then having a lot of different processes or systems that you throw at it. So I think the lesson is that the options are really endless, and it is, going back to how I started, a combination of both chance and intention. Like, at some point you just have to make a decision, do something, and do it as well as you can, and hope that it really matters. And I echo, you're going to be a lot better at something you care about than something you don't care about. So find something you really care about, but don't be so perfectionistic that that you aren't willing to try a lot of different stuff, because at your stage in the, you've got to start somewhere. So
Can I say one more thing? Is it Justin?
Yeah.
So one more thing I would say. Well, I don't know that I have the answer to your question, which I hear you saying, I'm trying to figure out where I fit in. What else would you think about doing? My advice is, while you're in law school, seek out as many mentors as you can find. Meet people in the law school, professors who have had professional experience, and outside of law school. Boston's filled with amazing lawyers. And talk to them and explore what it is that turns them on about their work, and see if something there excites you.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists. This has been a terrific conversation. We have a reception upstairs. We have food. We have drink. We have wine. I hope you can say, the students, come up and introduce yourself to our panelists. They've agreed to stay for a little while longer, and let's thank them for their coming.